Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Star Wars, Episode 7, The Force Awakens is frequently summarized as a nostalgic reclamation of the franchise, a deliberate act of cultural recycling designed to return the audience to the aesthetic and narrative rhythms of the original trilogy. This consensus position suggests the film is a safe, iterative exercise in brand management. However, this interpretation ignores the film's profound internal preoccupation with the crushing weight of legacy and the existential terror of living in the shadow of history. The Force Awakens functions as an inquiry into the instability of truth when that truth is mediated by myths, debris, and the physical ruins of a past that refuses to stay buried. The film demonstrates that identity, in a world dominated by monumental history, is not a birthright but a frantic act of self-invention. The world of Jakku serves as the primary visual and thematic anchor for this argument. It is a landscape defined by the literal wreckage of a fallen empire, where citizens survive by stripping the carcasses of machines that once commanded the galaxy. This is a society built upon the refuse of a grand narrative that has already collapsed. The architecture of the film, the massive, hulking skeletons of star destroyers, serves as a constant reminder that the protagonists are living in the ghost of a former golden age. Rey's existence as a scavenger is not merely a survival tactic, it is an epistemological baseline. She consumes the history of the galaxy as discarded metal, turning the artifacts of a legendary conflict into the mundane currency of her daily life. The film argues that in a hyper-mediated world, objective truth is buried under layers of scrap, leaving individuals to define themselves through the fragmented clues they find in the sand. The characters within this space inhabit a state of profound ontological fracture. Rey, Finn, and Kylo Ren are all defined by their efforts to either escape or inherit the heavy, predetermined labels assigned to them by the broader galaxy. Kylo Ren, in particular, represents the ultimate embodiment of the struggle against history. His obsession with his grandfather is a physical manifestation of a repressed identity. He wears a mask not to hide from the enemy, but to physically construct the self he believes he is meant to be. His violence is the logical output of a mind convinced that history is a weight one must either lift or be crushed by. While he seeks to destroy the past, his entire existence is a reaction to it, proving that the vacuum left by a failed grand narrative does not offer freedom, but rather creates a frantic, often destructive search for a new, singular purpose. The film's craft, specifically its commitment to tactile, weathered practical effects and sweeping, isolating cinematography, reinforces this sense of being dwarfed by systems that have outlived their inhabitants. By grounding the fantastical elements in the grime of physical reality, the film forces the viewer to confront the decay inherent in its setting. The technical decision to prioritize scale, placing characters against the vast, indifferent desert or the immense, mechanical terror of Starkiller Base, visualizes the insignificance of the individual against the gears of history. The camera often frames Rey as a tiny, isolated figure within the hollowed-out hulls of massive ships, emphasizing that she is navigating a reality that was built for giants and is now merely a tomb for the living. Ultimately, the film posits that the primary conflict is not between light and dark, but between those who are paralyzed by the gravitational pull of the past and those who, through sheer necessity, attempt to carve out a new existence in the wake of its destruction. The consensus view of the film as a nostalgic mirror fails to acknowledge the pervasive, melancholic anxiety that underscores every character arc. The characters do not just walk through the ruins of the past, they are haunted by the symbols and machines that define their world. The Force Awakens captures the existential burden of a generation struggling to find agency in a landscape where every landmark is a monument to someone else's triumph or failure. By the final frame, the film does not offer a return to the status quo, but rather a tentative, fragile beginning for individuals who have finally ceased to be mere scavengers of history and have begun, however uncertainly, to author their own. The subversion question. The common consensus surrounding Star Wars, The Force Awakens positions it as a nostalgic restoration of a mythic past, a film primarily concerned with reclaiming the aesthetic and narrative energy of the original trilogy. This reading, however, collapses under the weight of the film's actual structural priorities. The Force Awakens is a clinical examination of the trauma of inheritance and the psychological paralysis caused by living in the shadow of giants. Rather than an act of simple homage, the film functions as a systemic critique of historical determinism, illustrating how the obsession with an idealized past creates a parasitic environment that consumes the agency of the next generation. The film's true subject is the violence inherent in forcing the young to reenact the failures and triumphs of their predecessors. The world building of the film reinforces this theme of stagnant decay. While the galaxy ostensibly moves forward, it remains visually and geopolitically locked in the remnants of a previous era. The landscape of Jakku is not merely a desert planet but a graveyard of decommissioned machinery, where the characters literally pick through the rusted corpses of past wars to survive. This is an economy of obsolescence. Rey's existence as a scavenger is the baseline misery of this world. She is a ghost haunting the discarded hull of a fallen empire, turning the detritus of history into her only currency. When she navigates the interior of a downed Star Destroyer, she is physically traversing the bowels of a failed ideology, a sequence that highlights the film's preoccupation with the burden of what came before. The architecture of the Resistance and the First Order further reflects this stagnation, as both factions cling to the aesthetic and technological templates of the Galactic Civil War, failing to innovate because they are locked in a recursive loop of self-reference. At the center of this cycle is the psychological fracture experienced by the protagonists. Rey and Kylo Ren represent two divergent responses to the same foundational trauma, the abandonment by a lineage that equates identity with power. Rey occupies an epistemic void, constructing her ego through the hope of a return to a specific, mythologized point of origin. Her trauma is avoidant, manifesting as a desperate clinging to a family narrative that does not exist. Kylo Ren, conversely, embodies the destructive pursuit of that same narrative. His obsession with his grandfather's shadow is a literal manifestation of the film's thesis on the toxicity of history. He attempts to annihilate his own personhood to become a vessel for a legacy he does not understand, effectively turning his internal life into a performance of someone else's history. The film suggests that this impulse, to define oneself by the deeds of one's ancestors, is the primary obstacle to genuine self-actualization. The visual and technical craft of the film serves to isolate characters within these inherited spaces. The cinematography frequently frames Rey against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the desert, emphasizing her insignificance within the grand, oppressive metanarrative of the Force. When the action shifts to the Starkiller Base, the film adopts a colder, more synthetic visual language. The interior of the base is a cathedral of authoritarian repetition, a geometric prison where light and shadow are used to dictate the power imbalance between the past and the present. The sound design plays a critical role here, as the score constantly invokes the melodic motifs of John Williams' original compositions, effectively trapping the viewer within the same auditory cage as the characters. The film forces us to hear the past in every scene, mirroring the characters' inability to escape their own heritage. The moral framework of the film moves beyond simple binaries to challenge the necessity of the fight itself. The conflict between the First Order and the Resistance is not a struggle of progress against regression, but a struggle between two competing ways of honoring the dead. The Republic falls precisely because it remains committed to the illusion of order defined by the preceding generation, a complacency that allows the First Order, the radicalized, fetishistic remnant of that same era, to thrive. The film's rejection of this cycle is crystallized in the final encounter between Rey and Kylo Ren. The fight is not merely a clash of lightsabers, but a violent rejection of the roles history has forced upon them. By the time the film reaches its conclusion, it provides no comfort in the restoration of a status quo. Instead, it leaves the protagonist stranded in a world that is fundamentally broken, standing at the precipice of a future that requires the total destruction of the myths they were raised to worship. The legacy of The Force Awakens is not the return of a hero, but the painful, necessary realization that the past is a tomb, and that true agency begins only when one stops looking for one's reflection in the wreckage. The anomaly question. The Force Awakens functions as a profound examination of the burden of historical inheritance and the paralyzing inertia of myth-making. While often viewed as a mere retread of established narrative beats, the film is actually a rigorous psychological study of how the past, both collective and personal, imposes itself upon the present. The anomaly that anchors this thesis is the sudden, jarring emergence of Rey's aptitude with the Force during her confrontation with Kylo Ren. This moment, often critiqued as an unearned escalation, serves as the film's central philosophical pivot. It is not a plot convenience, but a manifestation of the protagonist's desperation to reconcile her own vacuum of identity with the weight of a legendary history she feels obligated to inhabit. The sociological environment of the film is defined by a landscape of entropic decay. Jakku exists as a graveyard of previous conflicts, where the remnants of massive, defunct imperial machines dictate the economic reality of its inhabitants. Scavengers do not merely survive on scraps, they exist within a literal ecosystem of obsolescence, commodifying the rusted-out wreckage of a war they did not fight but are nonetheless defined by. This visual geography creates a world where the present is entirely suffocated by the debris of the past. The architecture of the Star Destroyer hulks and the downed X-Wings serves as a constant reminder that the characters are living in the ruins of a golden age, struggling to find agency within a reality that feels already completed and fossilized. Psychologically, Rey and Kylo Ren act as binary responses to this historical pressure. Rey represents the denial of history, clinging to the fabricated ego of a scavenger waiting for a family that will never return, effectively using isolation as a coping mechanism for her abandonment. Her traumatic core is defined by the absence of narrative, she is a blank slate defined by her environment. Conversely, Kylo Ren represents the violent rejection of history, attempting to burn away his lineage to forge an identity through destruction. Their conflict is not merely political but epistemological, they are both grappling with the terror of being defined by figures who have already achieved mythic status. Kylo's obsession with Darth Vader is a desperate attempt to derive meaning from a predecessor, whereas Rey's fear of her own nascent power is the fear of being claimed by a history she does not understand. The philosophical framework of the film operates on the necessity of the individual to synthesize their own truth from the noise of competing ideologies. The Resistance and the First Order function as rigid, competing metanarratives, one claiming the legacy of democracy, the other the legacy of order, but both rely on the same fundamental mechanism, the commodification of conflict. The characters are trapped in a cycle where they must either replicate the successes of the past or suffer the consequences of failing to meet those predetermined expectations. The film suggests that the Force is not a mystical external law, but the raw, terrifying capacity for personal agency when the inherited scripts of society fail. Technically, the film utilizes a visual language that emphasizes the collision between the human and the monumental. The use of practical effects and location shooting grounds the characters within this landscape of decay, forcing a tactile confrontation with the past. When Rey enters the colossal interior of a fallen Star Destroyer, the cinematography uses scale to render her insignificant, underscoring her initial position as a small, forgotten entity within an overwhelming system. However, the pacing and editing shift during the climax on Starkiller Base, moving from the deliberate, observational rhythm of her life on Jakku to a fractured, kinetic intensity. This rupture represents the destruction of her internal facade. She can no longer observe history from the periphery and is forced to participate in its creation. Ultimately, the film posits that identity is not something one inherits, but something one creates through the deliberate abandonment of comfortable delusions. The final synthesis of the film, marked by Rey's departure to find Luke Skywalker, is not a return to the status quo but an acceptance of a terrifying, open-ended future. The film refuses to provide a neat resolution for the characters' legacies, instead leaving them in a state of suspended evolution. By forcing the protagonist to confront the reality that she is not a passenger in a pre-written myth but an active participant in an uncertain present, The Force Awakens achieves a resonance that transcends its structural familiarity. It is a work about the existential necessity of forging one's own path when all maps of the past have been rendered unreadable by time and trauma. The struggle is the meaning, and the uncertainty of the outcome is the only true form of freedom. The synthesis question. Star Wars: The Force Awakens functions as a deliberate exercise in the reclamation of mythic architecture, arguing that identity in a post-catastrophic society is defined entirely by the active mimicry of historical grandeur. The film posits that the primary currency of its universe is not wealth or political power, but the weight of narrative legacy. Characters within this reality do not merely live, they perform the roles inherited from a fractured history, treating the artifacts and ideologies of the past as the only valid framework for personal significance. This reliance on reenactment serves as the film's central psychological anchor, as individuals like Rey and Kylo Ren navigate a world where their survival depends on their ability to embody the archetypes established by their predecessors. The sociological environment is one of extreme material scarcity disguised by the sheer scale of salvaged grandeur. The galaxy is a graveyard of industrial ambition, where the remnants of massive, defunct starships dictate the topography of daily survival. On Jakku, the economy is literalized through the commodification of wreckage. The population exists in a state of terminal maintenance, recycling the discarded hulls of a fallen empire to fuel their own meager subsistence. This environment creates a psychological reliance on the past, as every citizen lives in the literal shadow of a larger, more coherent history. The visual language of the film reinforces this, constantly contrasting the vast, rusted skeletal remains of star destroyers with the fragile, organic persistence of the scavengers who inhabit them. Psychologically, Rey and Kylo Ren exist as mirrors reflecting the trauma of absent, mythologized figures. Rey's internal monologue is defined by an avoidant attachment to a non-existent family, her identity contingent upon the hope that her past will eventually grant her permission to exist in the present. She treats her own life as a placeholder, awaiting an external narrative to assign her meaning. Kylo Ren, conversely, suffers from a crushing performative burden, attempting to bridge the gap between his own fractured psyche and the imposing, monolithic shadow of his grandfather. His violence is not mere malice, but a desperate, somatic attempt to shed his humanity through the aesthetic adoption of dark-side iconography. He views his own capacity for doubt as a corruption that must be purged, literally and figuratively, through the destruction of his own familial ties. The film's philosophical foundation rests on the necessity of the heroic cycle as a prophylactic against nihilism. In a world where institutional stability, the Republic, the Jedi Order, has proven fragile and easily dismantled, the individual is forced to turn to absolute moral structures to orient themselves. The Force acts as the ultimate arbiter of truth, providing a binary morality in a reality that is otherwise decaying into moral and physical entropy. The film argues that in the absence of a functional state, characters must adopt the roles of Jedi or Sith to escape the meaninglessness of their scavenger existences. The struggle is not merely for political control, but for the right to claim the title of protagonist in a universe that has long since stopped providing them. Technically, the film utilizes a production design strategy that privileges tactile, analog weight over the frictionless surfaces of digital artifice. By prioritizing practical effects and location-based shooting, the film grounds its high-concept space opera in a visceral, lived-in reality that echoes the decay of its subject matter. The cinematography relies on wide, sweeping frames that isolate characters against vast, uncaring landscapes, effectively visualizing the insignificance of the individual compared to the crushing scale of history. When the camera focuses on the intimate, often trembling expressions of Rey or the frantic, jagged movements of Kylo Ren, it emphasizes their vulnerability within a landscape they are desperately trying to dominate. Ultimately, The Force Awakens asserts that the burden of legacy is the engine of human action. The recursive nature of the plot, the destruction of yet another superweapon, the search for a missing mentor, the reliance on ancestral weapons, is not a limitation of creativity, but an expression of the character's inability to break free from the gravitational pull of their own history. The film concludes with the literal passing of a lightsaber, an object that carries the weight of multiple generations, symbolizing that in this world, one does not create a future so much as inherit a weapon. By the final frame, the synthesis is complete, the individual is defined by what they salvage from the past, and the only path forward is to commit fully to the mask that history has provided. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. Star Wars: The Force Awakens functions as a meditation on the persistence of historical debris, illustrating a galaxy defined by the commodification of wreckage. In this reality, the fundamental currency is not gold or digital credit, but the physical remnants of past conflicts. The world operates on a scavenged economy where the primary value resides in the husks of dead empires. This is most vividly realized on Jakku, where the skyline is composed of star destroyers and transport ships reduced to jagged, hollowed-out skeletons. These monuments of failed governance are systematically dismantled by a labor force that extracts raw scrap for subsistence, effectively turning the ghosts of war into the survival tools of the present. The visual hierarchy reinforces this system, while the political entities of the Resistance and the First Order wield immense, clean-line technological power. The civilian baseline exists in a state of perpetual maintenance, sifting through the rust of fallen regimes to remain alive. This economic structure establishes a baseline of pervasive scarcity. Life for a typical scavenger on Jakku is a cycle of hyperlocalized survival, where individual agency is dictated by the ability to trade salvaged parts for portions of water and caloric rations. The presence of the black market, represented by Unkar Plut, highlights exactly what the society lacks: structural stability and equitable resource distribution. Plut functions as a local monopolist, a mediator who processes the scrap that flows into the central hub, commodifying the labor of thousands into a centralized stockpile. The scarcity of clean, functioning technology forces a rigid stratification of access. High-tier technology remains the exclusive domain of those who possess the political or martial infrastructure to maintain it, while the rest of the populace is relegated to obsolete, patched-together hardware that is as dangerous to operate as it is vital for survival. The sociological environment is one in which the past is not a memory, but an active, physical layer of the present landscape. The characters move through this world by navigating these historical ruins. The vast, wide-angle shots of the desert landscapes emphasize the insignificance of the individual against the sheer scale of the waste left behind by massive, competing ideologies. This landscape of decay suggests a society that has become trapped in an endless feedback loop of repeating the errors of its ancestors, as the materials of old wars are perpetually recycled into the tools for new ones. The human element is deeply shaped by this environment of scarcity and remnants. Characters like Rey do not define themselves through social status, but through the mastery of salvaged tools, a physical intimacy with broken machinery that mirrors their own internal fractures. The trauma of the core narrative is tied directly to this reliance on the discarded. The protagonist's identity is rooted in an environment that prioritizes the utility of an object over its origin. Because their world is constructed from the trash of failed systems, the characters are forced to perform a form of ontological synthesis. They are not merely living in a place, they are actively assembling their lives from the debris of what came before. This pervasive commodification of the past informs the film's moral framework. The characters inhabit a reality where the boundary between a person and their tools is dangerously thin. To be an individual in this universe is to be a scavenger, constantly curating one's existence from the refuse of grand, systemic conflicts. The visual language of the film, with its tactile, practical effects and weathered textures, cements this truth. There is no sleek, utopian veneer in the world of the scavengers, there is only the harsh, honest light of a desert sun hitting the scraped metal of a long-abandoned machine. The film suggests that in the wake of collapsed grand narratives, the only remaining act of agency is the deliberate, skillful repurposing of history. Through this prism, the struggle of the protagonist becomes an attempt to move beyond the cycle of salvage and into an existence not defined solely by the leftovers of a dying galactic order. The film presents a universe that refuses to be buried, forcing its inhabitants to contend with the physical reality of a past that refuses to stay dead. Architecture and the visual geography. Star Wars: The Force Awakens functions as an intricate study of a civilization defined by the literal and metaphorical debris of its own history. The production design establishes a world where power is derived not from creation, but from the reclamation and weaponization of a decaying past. By anchoring the narrative in a geography of ruin, the film articulates a reality where the architectural hierarchy is dictated by the proximity to the remnants of a fallen galactic order. The visual geography of Jakku serves as the definitive baseline for this world, characterizing a society that exists entirely within the shadows of dead technology. Here, the landscape is defined by the colossal, rusted remains of starships, transforming the natural desert into a graveyard of industrial ambition. The production design treats these wrecks as the primary resource of the economy, forcing the civilian population to inhabit the hollowed-out hulls of massive machines. This creates a claustrophobic existence where human survival is inextricably linked to the scavenging of obsolete hardware. In this environment, the wealthy and powerful are absent, leaving behind a stratified struggle where the scavengers at the bottom of the hierarchy are forced to navigate the sprawling, chaotic debris fields, quite literally mining the past to endure the present. In stark contrast, the First Order operates within environments of sterile, oppressive precision. The architectural language of Starkiller Base and the finalizer is one of frictionless surfaces and rigid geometry, signaling a total control over the environment that ignores the organic world entirely. The visual transition from the cluttered, subterranean existence of Rey's life on Jakku to the cold, expansive interiors of the First Order's warships highlights a deliberate erasure of individuality. Within these corporate militaristic spaces, the camera glides with a clinical, detached rhythm, emphasizing the lack of autonomy granted to those who serve the machine. The scale of these structures is utilized to dwarf the individual, rendering characters as mere components within a vast, self-perpetuating system of authority. The film effectively uses the contrast between the synthetic and the organic to comment on the state of the galaxy. Nature in this world is perpetually encroaching upon or being buried by the synthetic. On Takodana, the ruins of the castle are slowly being reclaimed by the forest, suggesting a cyclical struggle where the remnants of conflict are gradually erased by the persistence of the natural world. Conversely, the Starkiller Base represents the final apex of synthetic dominance, a technological construct that consumes an entire planet to fuel its own destructive output. This visual choice positions the conflict not merely as a battle between factions, but as a struggle between those who wish to live amidst the history of the world and those who wish to consume the world to serve their ideology. The geography of navigation further reinforces this sense of systemic decay. Characters are rarely afforded smooth, direct transit. Instead, they move through forced, erratic paths carved out by the wreckage of previous eras. Whether running through the cramped, dust-choked corridors of a downed Star Destroyer or navigating the labyrinthine interior of a freighter, movement is defined by obstruction and necessity. The camera work during these sequences emphasizes the effort required to traverse this world, grounding the action in a tactile, physical reality that feels heavy and worn. Even in the film's most high-tech environments, the presence of scuffed metal, flickering consoles, and manual overrides insists that this is a society functioning on the edge of collapse, sustained only by the brute force of its own inertia. Ultimately, the visual language of the film reveals a galaxy that has become a museum of its own failures. By prioritizing practical textures and utilizing massive, immersive set extensions that prioritize depth and scale, the film makes the insignificance of the individual against the system a palpable sensory experience. The characters are caught in a relentless architectural cycle, living in the rusted-out remnants of a golden age while simultaneously being crushed by the encroaching, sterile reach of a new, absolute authority. Through this, the film presents a world where history is not a guide for the future, but a heavy, physical burden that dictates the parameters of every life, trapping inhabitants in a perpetual negotiation with the ghosts of the infrastructure surrounding them. Epistemology, information, and society. Star Wars: The Force Awakens functions as a profound meditation on the fragility of historical memory and the desperate human impulse to anchor identity within the wreckage of established narratives. The film posits that in a galaxy defined by the decay of former empires, truth is no longer a shared objective reality but a fragmented, highly contested relic salvaged from the dunes of the past. The central crisis of the narrative is not merely the conflict between light and dark, but an epistemological struggle to reclaim a history that has been systematically sanitized, mythologized, or buried beneath the junk heaps of societal collapse. The world-building of the film establishes a reality where information acts as the most volatile currency. Characters navigate a landscape where history has been reduced to bedtime stories and half-remembered rumors. For scavengers like Rey, reality is defined by physical labor within the literal detritus of a fallen civilization, where the remains of massive star destroyers and AT-ATs serve as the only tangible evidence of a previous epoch. The social order is built upon these ruins, creating a hierarchy where the ability to interpret and repurpose obsolete technology dictates one's survival. This creates an environment where knowledge is isolated and anecdotal. In the absence of a functioning central archive, individuals like Rey are forced to construct their own sense of self through the interpretation of physical artifacts, effectively turning the past into a subjective psychological projection rather than a historical constant. The propaganda engines of the First Order and the Resistance demonstrate how power in this universe is maintained through the active curation of historical narratives. The First Order represents a form of neo-imperialism that rejects the complexities of the past, opting instead to enforce an aggressive, sanitized vision of order that erases the ideological nuances of the conflict that preceded it. They occupy space with a sterile, monochromatic rigidity that stands in stark opposition to the chaotic, organic rot of planets like Jakku. By projecting this singular, overwhelming visual authority, they attempt to replace the collective memory of the citizenry with a state-sanctioned metanarrative of restoration. Conversely, the Resistance operates within the margins, relying on the persistence of oral tradition and personal legacy to combat this erasure. The film illustrates that the truth of the galaxy is a battleground where the victors rewrite the definitions of heroism and villainy to suit their immediate tactical requirements. Furthermore, the characters exist within an information ecosystem that is both hyperconnected and profoundly starved of vital context. The younger generation, represented by Rey and Finn, is functionally illiterate regarding the recent history of their world. They possess the capacity for advanced technological operation yet lack the philosophical framework to understand the significance of the symbols they encounter. When the legends of the Jedi and the Rebellion are mentioned, they are received with a skepticism born of ignorance, highlighting how effectively the systemic collapse has severed the link between the present and the past. This data-rich but knowledge-poor condition forces the protagonists to undergo a painful process of deconstruction, as they must reconcile the stories they have been told with the brutal, immediate evidence of their own experiences. The visual geography of the film reinforces this theme of historical displacement. The cinematography emphasizes the contrast between the vast, indifferent emptiness of desert landscapes and the cramped, industrial interiors of base ships and outposts. In these spaces, individuals are framed as fleeting occupants of grand, ancient structures that dwarf them, suggesting that the current generation is merely a transient present scavenging for meaning in a world they did not build and do not fully comprehend. The use of practical effects and tactile, lived-in set design ensures that the audience feels the weight of this history, the rust, the grit, and the cold metal, grounding the existential questions of identity in a physical reality that demands acknowledgement. Ultimately, The Force Awakens asserts that identity is an act of creation in the face of historical erasure. The film's most pivotal moments occur when characters reject the externally imposed narratives of the state or the static warnings of their predecessors to define their own path. By placing the burden of history squarely upon the shoulders of individuals who have been socially and politically excluded from the centers of power, the film argues that the future is only recoverable once the protagonist recognizes the illusory nature of the consensus reality. The struggle is not to restore a past that has already been commodified and corrupted, but to navigate the silence of the void and, in doing so, craft a new, authentic existence from the pieces of a fractured, forgotten world. The film stands as a testament to the idea that as long as the relics of the past remain to be found, the possibility for individual agency, and the reclamation of truth, remains alive. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Star Wars, Episode VII, The Force Awakens functions as a profound examination of the physical and psychological debris left in the wake of collapsed ideological systems. While the film is often viewed through the lens of nostalgia, it is fundamentally a study of how individuals survive and define their agency within a graveyard of fallen political architectures. The world of the film is defined by the absolute erosion of central authority. The New Republic exists as a distant, abstract entity that fails to project power, leaving the vacuum to be filled by the First Order, a paramilitary remnant that operates with the ruthlessness of a private corporation unburdened by statecraft. This shift creates a reality where law is effectively non-existent, replaced by the immediate, brutal extraction of value from resources and human subjects alike. On planets like Jakku, the economic baseline is defined by the commodification of the past. Scavengers like Rey do not participate in a functioning civilization. They inhabit a post-apocalyptic industrial site, stripping the rusted-out bones of a war fought by previous generations. This physical environment dictates the psychological state of the inhabitants. The massive, decaying hulls of star destroyers and AT-ATs serve as more than mere set design. They are literal monuments to the failure of prior regimes, standing as immovable constraints upon the present. The inhabitants are tethered to these husks, forced to process the wreckage for survival. This is a society that has lost the ability to innovate or govern, forced to rely on the cannibalization of historical assets to sustain a precarious, day-to-day existence. This systemic decay acts as the primary sociological catalyst for the protagonist. Rey exists in a state of stagnant isolation, trapped by the scarcity of her environment and the lack of a broader social framework. Her world is one where the state provides no protection or infrastructure, meaning her only value is the labor she can extract from the junk she processes. The film posits that in the absence of a meaningful governing order, individuals like Rey internalize their own survival as their only purpose. Her commitment to waiting for a return from her past is not merely an emotional choice, it is a desperate attempt to impose a narrative of continuity onto a world that has clearly moved on from the people she once knew. Her agency is frozen, kept in stasis by the belief that her existence is defined by someone else's eventual return. The First Order represents the inevitable outcome of this power vacuum. By adopting the aesthetic and totalizing reach of the previous regime while stripping away the pretense of democratic function, they represent the ultimate consolidation of control. Their authority is absolute, backed by the ability to utilize technology as a weapon of planetary annihilation, effectively replacing diplomacy with the threat of total erasure. This is a force that does not seek to build or nurture but to impose a rigid, disciplined order over the chaos of a fragmented galaxy. The tension in the film stems from the collision between the scattered, scavenging nature of those living on the fringes and the monolithic, repressive structure the First Order seeks to re-establish. The film's visual language reinforces this conflict between the small, organic, and scavenging nature of the individual and the cold, immense, and sterile architecture of the ruling ideology. When the camera focuses on Rey in the vast, empty dunes of Jakku, she is dwarfed by the environment, suggesting the insignificance of the individual against the sheer scale of the system. In contrast, the interiors of the Starkiller Base and the First Order capital ships are defined by high-contrast lighting, harsh geometric lines, and a deliberate absence of warmth. These spaces are designed to strip away individual identity, turning soldiers into faceless, repeating digits within an apparatus of power. The technological tipping point, the weaponized planet, is the logical culmination of this philosophy, representing a transition from localized control to an omnipotent, godlike authority that exists beyond the reach of any civilian oversight. Ultimately, The Force Awakens argues that history exerts a crushing, gravitational pull on the individual, one that can only be escaped through a fundamental rejection of the scavenged narratives of the past. The protagonist's journey is defined by the moment she stops viewing herself as a relic of her own history and begins to act as a catalyst for a new, uncertain future. By moving beyond the rusted ruins that define her reality, she asserts an autonomy that the surrounding systems seek to extinguish. The conflict, therefore, is not merely a war between light and dark, but a struggle to reclaim agency in a galaxy that has been turned into a marketplace of decaying ideologies. The film serves as a testament to the idea that, even in a world defined by the collapse of everything that came before, the act of choosing a path independent of that wreckage is the most profound reclamation of the self. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The core of Star Wars, The Force Awakens resides in the agonizing tension between a legacy of mythic history and the profound, isolating silence of the individual. Rey enters the narrative as an embodiment of self-constructed epistemic confinement, defined entirely by her daily labor in the salvage yards of Jakku. Her fabricated ego, that of a lowly scavenger waiting for a return that will validate her existence, serves as a survival mechanism, a restrictive metanarrative that allows her to persist in a state of purgatorial decay. This identity is not merely a choice, it is an internal prison built from the scraps of a history she does not fully understand, reflecting a society that has commodified the remnants of past wars into the literal currency of the present. The epistemic fracture occurs the moment Rey touches the Skywalker lightsaber in Maz Kanata's castle. In this sequence, her internal reality, which she had carefully curated as one of abandonment and anonymity, is violently shattered by a cascade of visions that connect her personal trauma to the broader cosmic struggle. The transition from the scavenger's solitary, localized survival to a participant in an inherited fate is abrupt and disorienting. She does not process this shift through dialogue, instead, she retreats into a visceral, somatic flight response. Her reaction, a desperate attempt to run from the calling of the Force, is the ultimate manifestation of her cognitive dissonance. She attempts to deny the immense power and responsibility unfolding within her, clinging to the familiar, meager comfort of the scavenger role because the alternative requires her to confront the reality that her truth was an illusion. This resistance highlights the fundamental limits of language within the film's universe. Rey is consistently unable to articulate the depth of her isolation or the terrifying speed at which her world is expanding. When she expresses that she is no one, she is not merely being humble, she is expressing a profound lack of vocabulary to define herself outside of the binary of abandonment or lineage. Similarly, the antagonist, Kylo Ren, suffers from a mirror image of this linguistic and identity crisis. His violent outbursts and performative cruelty are attempts to force a coherent, imposing narrative onto his own fractured psyche. He operates under the belief that he can exert willpower to resolve the internal dissonance of his lineage, yet his actions repeatedly betray the lingering, vulnerable identity of Ben Solo. The film portrays this through his physical and vocal instability. He is a character screaming to be understood while simultaneously destroying the very history that provides him with context. The film visually maps these internal conflicts onto the environment, using the contrast between the vast, indifferent landscapes and the claustrophobic, synthetic interiors of the First Order to externalize the character's mental states. Rey's evolution is marked by a move from the wide, desolate, and isolating dunes of Jakku, where the scale of the world renders her personal history irrelevant, to the snowy, suffocating forests of Starkiller Base, where her conflict becomes intimate and absolute. The Force itself acts as the catalyst that dissolves the barriers of the fabricated ego, forcing these characters to confront the reality that they cannot define themselves in a vacuum. By the time Rey finally accepts the call to action, the film has successfully dismantled the protective, albeit miserable, stories these characters told themselves. They are pushed beyond the limits of their programmed responses, forced to engage with an objective reality that demands accountability for one's choices rather than a retreat into the inherited myths of the past. The journey is one of shedding the armor of identity to reveal the raw, unscripted potential of the self. Trauma and somatic experiencing. Star Wars: The Force Awakens functions as a profound meditation on the somatic legacy of violence and the way trauma manifests within the architecture of the self. At its center, the film establishes a world where the characters are defined not by their conscious aspirations, but by the physical and psychological imprints of their pasts. This is a story about the inertia of memory, where history is not merely a sequence of events but a persistent, vibrating tension stored within the bodies of its protagonists. Rey's existence on Jakku serves as the primary study of trauma as a somatic anchor. Her primary defense mechanism is avoidant. She occupies a landscape of literal wreckage, spending her days dismantling the debris of a previous generation's cataclysmic failures. This labor is both economic and therapeutic. By reducing the grand machinery of history, the hulking, rusted shells of star destroyers, to scavenged components, she attempts to master the very forces that abandoned her. Her physicality is defined by this survivalist rhythm, the repetitive motion of sliding down dunes, the precise handling of a staff, and the consumption of meager rations. Her trauma is anchored in the temporal, specifically the phantom expectation of a return that never manifests. This waiting is a physical sensation, a hollow space she occupies until the inciting incident pulls her into the orbit of the conflict. The antagonist, Kylo Ren, offers the inverse trajectory of this somatic haunting. While Rey hides her trauma behind a facade of pragmatic resilience, Kylo Ren performs his struggle through a violent rejection of his own biology. He treats his body as a canvas for the agony of his dual lineage, donning a mask that serves as a sensory barrier between himself and the world. This mask acts as an externalized ego, a structural attempt to suppress the erratic, shivering emotional responses that betray his devotion to the dark side. When he removes his helmet, his face remains a site of perpetual conflict. His physical reaction to stress, the impulsive, frantic lashing out with his lightsaber, reveals that he is unable to integrate his history into his identity. He does not process his trauma, he physically enacts it upon his environment, attempting to cauterize his internal pain by inflicting it on the exterior world. The film meticulously links these internal struggles to the external architecture of the galaxy. The Starkiller Base acts as the ultimate physical manifestation of this generational wounding, a planet-sized engine of destruction that echoes the original Death Star. It is a monument to repetition compulsion, representing the galaxy's inability to move beyond the cycle of totalitarian imposition. The characters are caught in a feedback loop where they are perpetually trying to exert control over the same weapons and philosophies that destroyed their ancestors. The act of fighting the system is rendered as a desperate attempt to break free from these inherited physical scars. Somatic memory informs every confrontation, most notably in the final duel between Rey and Kylo Ren. This sequence is not merely a clash of ideologies but a collision of two differently damaged nervous systems. When Rey finally taps into the Force, the movement is sudden, visceral, and grounded in the muscle memory of her survival on Jakku. Her victory is a reclamation of her own agency, a shift from being a spectator of the debris to an active participant in her own fate. Conversely, Kylo Ren's defeat is a breakdown of his rigid, performative armor. The structural integrity of his persona shatters, leaving him exposed and physically diminished. Ultimately, The Force Awakens posits that the human element is defined by the tension between the desire for clean, historical resolution and the messy, physical reality of survival. The trauma of the past is not something that can be intellectualized or deleted, it is stored in the posture, the reflex, and the repetitive behaviors of those tasked with inheriting a broken world. By grounding these mythic stakes in the intimate, somatic experiences of its protagonists, the film argues that the path forward requires an honest confrontation with the physical pain of the past. The characters do not heal through transcendence, but through the difficult, grounded work of recognizing their own scars and choosing to move differently within the architecture of their own lives. Their agency is found in the moment they cease repeating the motions of the broken machinery surrounding them, choosing instead to define themselves by the present, raw experience of their own resilience. The shadow and the antagonist. The Force Awakens serves as a profound psychological study of generational trauma, where the central conflict is not merely a galactic struggle for power but an internal collapse of identity. Kylo Ren stands as the quintessential Jungian shadow, a physical manifestation of the unresolved grief and fractured legacy inherent in the Skywalker lineage. His existence provides a visceral contrast to Rey's journey, functioning as the repository for all the traits his family bloodline seeks to suppress. Where Rey is defined by her desperate search for belonging and her attempt to construct a coherent ego from the ruins of a forgotten history, Kylo Ren is defined by his active attempt to dismantle his own history. His logic is startlingly pragmatic. He views the shedding of his heritage, the destruction of his past and the rejection of his parental attachments as the only path to authentic self-actualization. To him, the light is a parasitic legacy that demands total conformity, and his turn toward the dark side is a logical, albeit violent, effort to reclaim agency from a deterministic destiny. This dynamic creates a mirror between the two, as both characters are trapped in a cycle of repetition compulsion. They are both scavengers in their own right, picking through the remnants of a titanic war that preceded their maturity. Rey seeks to restore the broken machines and lost artifacts of a golden age, essentially trying to fix the world so she might finally find a place within it. Kylo Ren, conversely, seeks to burn those artifacts down, believing that the only way to achieve freedom is to obliterate the symbols of the old world that hold him in contempt. The film positions Kylo as the mirror of Rey's own potential path toward radical isolation. Because both characters are abandoned by their mentors, Rey by the desert and her own memory, Kylo by the failure of the New Republic and the Jedi Order, they share an identical vulnerability. The relationship between them becomes a volatile exchange of emotional capital. Rey's strength stems from her ability to find value in the wreckage, whereas Kylo's strength is drawn from his capacity to view that wreckage as a cage. When they clash, they are effectively fighting their own internal mirrors. Kylo sees in Rey the terrifying possibility of the light, a future he has convinced himself is impossible, and this projection fuels his hostility. Rey, meanwhile, projects her fear of worthlessness onto the structure she attempts to defend. The film treats their connection as a symbiosis of trauma. They recognize the hollow resonance of the other's pain. This recognition is why their final confrontation feels less like a battle for political supremacy and more like a desperate, violent argument over the nature of truth itself. The film underscores this by placing Finn in the role of the secondary mirror character. Like both Rey and Kylo, Finn is a product of systemic abandonment, forcibly stripped of his name and identity by a regime that weaponized his childhood. However, where Rey seeks a family and Kylo seeks to destroy his, Finn makes the choice to reject the totality of the system altogether. He does not wish to uphold the Republic or ascend the hierarchy of the First Order, he chooses the radical autonomy of the exile. Through Finn, the film reveals that the trauma experienced by the protagonists is not an inescapable fate, but a condition that can be navigated through the simple, terrifying act of walking away from the narrative entirely. Ultimately, the conflict in The Force Awakens is rooted in the characters' inability to reconcile their lived reality with the gargantuan mythos that surrounds them. They are all struggling to define themselves in the shadow of giants, and their individual arcs are defined by how they negotiate that burden. The film proves that the true struggle is not the technological one, the Starkiller Base or the fleet engagements, but the epistemic crisis of the individual. Every action taken by Rey or Kylo is a desperate attempt to answer the question of whether one is a product of their origin or an architect of their own design. By framing their interactions as a convergence of repressed desires and projected fears, the film turns the grand space opera into an intimate, haunting exploration of how human beings survive when their internal worlds are as broken as the civilizations they inhabit. The visual proof of the psyche. The human experience within The Force Awakens is defined by the tension between the weight of historical legacy and the desperate search for individual identity. Rey's journey, specifically, functions as an exploration of trauma manifesting through spatial isolation and the slow disintegration of a self-imposed facade. Throughout the film, Rey is visually and physically positioned in ways that emphasize her insignificance against the gargantuan scale of the galaxy's remnants. Her life as a scavenger on Jakku is not merely a setting but a psychological state. She exists within the hollowed-out skeletons of massive Imperial cruisers, physically dwarfed by the discarded machinery of a failed regime. This VFX-driven isolation serves to render her internal loneliness tangible, projecting her smallness against a world defined by the debris of history. Her behavior is governed by a rigid, survivalist performance. When navigating public spaces like the Nimmer outpost, Rey operates with a performative efficiency, masking her vulnerability behind a hardened, utilitarian exterior. She treats her body as a tool of labor, moving with a guarded, somatic precision that prioritizes endurance over connection. This facade acts as a protective shell, yet it is consistently punctured by diegetic triggers that bridge her current reality with the trauma of her abandonment. The familiar, rhythmic thrum of passing transports or the specific hue of twilight over the desert wastes functions as a sensory reminder of her temporal stasis. These cues force her to confront the dissonance between her conscious desire for community and her deeply ingrained belief that she is fundamentally alone. The film excels in utilizing the uncanny nature of Kylo Ren to reflect the fractured psyches of its protagonists. Ren behaves with a chilling, systematic rigidity that borders on the robotic, masking his emotional instability beneath a persona of total conviction. He embodies the internal struggle of the film's characters, the desire to shed the skin of one's upbringing to forge an autonomous identity. His masks and rituals are not merely aesthetic choices, they are performative constructs designed to suppress his humanity. When he removes his mask in the presence of Rey, the film strips away his protective layer, revealing the raw, unrefined fear that drives his violence. This moment of vulnerability highlights the inherent contradiction within Ren. He is a man attempting to reach an ideal of absolute authority while simultaneously being consumed by the chaotic uncertainty of his own impulses. Rey's breaking point occurs when she is forced to confront the limits of her own metanarrative. For much of the film, she tells herself that her worth is tied to waiting for a return, a belief that justifies her suffering. The shift in her psyche happens as she is physically separated from her past, drawn into the conflict of the resistance, and pushed to acknowledge the power within her that exists independently of her origin. The final sequences, particularly on the craggy, isolated terrain of H2, provide the ultimate visual representation of her ego's transition. The vast, indifferent beauty of the island forces her into a space where the noise of her previous survivalist life is rendered obsolete. She stands alone, not as a scavenger defined by her environment, but as an individual defined by her capacity for choice. This evolution is fundamentally a story of reclaiming the self from the deterministic pressures of the past. The visual language of the film, placing characters against overwhelming architectural ghosts, constantly asks whether an individual can exist apart from the machines and ideologies that shaped them. By the time Rey extends her hand to Luke, the facade has completely dropped. She is no longer the girl waiting in the shadow of a fallen ship, she is an active participant in a new reality. The film proves that even in a world cluttered with the relics of previous generations, the human element remains capable of asserting agency. The characters are not merely cogs in a larger sociological engine, but individuals who, through the process of shedding their self-fabricated defenses, arrive at a truth that is both terrifying and liberating. They are responsible for creating their own meaning. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. The Force Awakens functions as a meditation on the persistence of historical myth-making and the weight of inherited narratives. In this universe, truth is not an objective, static fact but a malleable construct defined by the artifacts of a bygone era. The film posits that reality is heavily mediated by the material remains of the past, the hulking, rusted carcasses of star destroyers and the weathered helmets of fallen soldiers. These objects act as the primary epistemic authority for the characters, serving as the physical anchors for a history that has faded into folklore. Rey, residing in the wreckage of Jakku, literalizes this dynamic. Her knowledge of the galaxy is confined to the salvaged components of abandoned machines, making her world an epistemic echo chamber where the past dictates the boundaries of her present potential. Language in this film acts as a restrictive framework, where the vocabulary of the galaxy is dominated by the nomenclature of legacy. The conflict is perpetually narrated through the labels of resistance and first order, terms that serve as ideological state apparatuses designed to force individuals into pre-existing roles. The characters do not merely inhabit the present, they perform their identities according to the myth surrounding the Jedi and the Sith. The film treats these narratives not as optional stories but as structural imperatives that govern behavior. When Han Solo tells Rey and Finn that the legends of the Force are true, he is performing an act of epistemic restoration, shifting their understanding of reality from a localized, scavenger-based existence to one integrated into a grand, cosmic history. The film explores the concept of the post-truth state through the lens of fragmentation. Because the official history of the galaxy has become obscured by time and distance, the citizens rely on competing, often contradictory, bits of information. The First Order capitalizes on this epistemic instability, projecting a version of the past that serves their current consolidation of power, while the Resistance operates on the belief that a singular, heroic truth remains accessible. The film avoids a purely relativistic stance, instead arguing that truth in this universe is discovered through somatic experience and the intuitive grasp of the Force. The Force acts as a sensory absolute, cutting through the noise of propaganda and historical distortion to provide a direct, albeit difficult, connection to reality. For characters like Kylo Ren, this creates a profound psychological rupture. He possesses an intimate connection to the lineage of the past, yet he perceives it as a burden that requires destruction, leading him to reject his own history in a desperate attempt to craft a new, autonomous truth. The moral calculus of the film is tethered to this battle over the definition of the past. Ethics are not arrived at through abstract reasoning but through the acceptance of one's place within the unfolding narrative of the Force. The act of choosing a side is an act of reclaiming agency within a world dominated by the ghosts of the galactic civil war. By grounding the characters in the ruins of the Empire, the film illustrates how individuals are often forced to construct their identities from the literal refuse of their predecessors. The characters' struggles reflect a deep-seated anxiety about the nature of legacy, suggesting that truth is a living process that must be physically manifested through action rather than simply inherited through belief. The technical execution of the film reinforces this theme of historical weight. By prioritizing practical effects and location-based cinematography over purely digital artifice, the film imbues its world with a sense of tangible permanence. The dirt on Rey's face, the tactile rust of the AT-AT, and the authentic heat of the desert landscape serve to validate the reality of the characters' experiences. The audience perceives these environments as existing independently of the characters, establishing a world where history has a physical presence that cannot be easily erased. The visual language of the film confirms that while narratives may be fluid, the physical consequences of the past are immutable. Ultimately, the film asserts that human agency resides in the ability to perceive the truth behind the inherited myth, choosing to engage with the reality of the present rather than becoming a prisoner to the manufactured narratives of those who came before. The journey of the protagonist is an intellectual and spiritual awakening, a transition from a life defined by the limitations of scavenged scraps to a life defined by the clarity of the Force. Metanarratives and social theory. Star Wars: The Force Awakens functions as a profound meditation on the collapse of grand narratives and the subsequent hauntological struggle of individuals living within the debris of a failed ideological order. The film presents a universe where the previous, totalizing myths of the Jedi and the Galactic Empire have dissolved into fragmented, commodified symbols. Characters like Rey and Finn exist in a state of epistemological exile, scavenging for meaning in a galaxy defined by the ruin of history rather than its progression. The film posits that the primary conflict of its reality is not merely a military confrontation between the Resistance and the First Order, but an existential crisis regarding how the living negotiate their identities when the structural scaffolding of their society has been rendered obsolete by the passage of time. This collapse is most visible in the way the film treats the relics of the past. The Downstar destroyers on Jakku are not mere set pieces, they are the literal, skeletal remains of an era that promised total order through authoritarian force. Rey's survival is predicated on an ironic repurposing of this wreckage. She extracts value from the dying carcass of the Empire, turning the machinery of galactic subjugation into a subsistence lifestyle. This represents a complete failure of the grand narrative of the state, as the symbols of historical power have become the raw materials for a scavenger's economy. The film suggests that when history fails, the individual is forced to engage in a hypermaterialistic relationship with the past, effectively stripping the myth of its power to function as a societal directive. The First Order, meanwhile, functions as a desperate attempt to reconstruct a lost ideological state apparatus. By modeling themselves directly upon the aesthetic and bureaucratic structures of their predecessors, they are engaged in an act of historical performativity. They utilize the propaganda of the past, magnified through the scale of Starkiller Base, to impose order upon a population that no longer shares their foundational delusions. The film showcases how this ruling class relies on the projection of absolute authority to paper over their lack of genuine legitimacy. Their existence is a feedback loop. They are trapped in a cycle of repetition compulsion, attempting to force the galaxy back into a predetermined shape that has already been irrevocably shattered. Within this landscape, the Force itself ceases to be a reliable theological framework and instead becomes an unpredictable, emergent phenomenon. The characters' struggle to understand their place in this reality reflects the fragmentation of truth in a post-narrative society. The epistemic authority formerly held by the Jedi is now a contested space, filled with hearsay, legend, and doubt. This absence of a central, coherent doctrine forces the protagonist, Rey, to construct her own agency within a void. She is not a cog in a pre-written destiny so much as she is an individual navigating a world that has discarded its own roadmap. Her journey is defined by the necessity of forging a subjective morality when the objective morality of the old world has proven incapable of preventing its own implosion. This philosophical tension culminates in the film's treatment of the struggle between the self and the systemic. The characters operate in a state of hyperreality, where the images of the past, the helmet of Darth Vader, the tales of Luke Skywalker, exert more influence on the present than the material reality of their daily lives. Kylo Ren represents the most extreme version of this crisis, as he attempts to define his identity by consuming the history that preceded him, ultimately finding that the commodification of his own lineage provides no spiritual or political stability. The film argues that meaningful action emerges only when the character acknowledges the failure of these narratives and chooses to exist in the present, unburdened by the requirements of a predetermined destiny. Ultimately, The Force Awakens serves as an analysis of the exhaustion of legacy. It identifies that when an entire society is built upon the ruins of a collapsed belief system, the duty of the next generation is not to restore the original structure, but to navigate the silence that follows. The final act of discovery, where Rey confronts the remnants of the past to find a new beginning, is not a return to a stable equilibrium. Instead, it is a radical claim that existence itself is the only meaningful counter-narrative to a world defined by the collapse of its own justifications. The film resolves its central conflict by demonstrating that the power to act is found not in the inheritance of a failed grand design, but in the existential courage to define one's own reality within the wreckage. Ethics and the moral calculus. Star Wars, Episode VII, The Force Awakens functions as a rigorous inquiry into the burden of legacy and the necessity of individual moral assertion within a collapsing institutional framework. The film operates as a testament to the idea that identity is not a predetermined inheritance, but an active, ongoing construction of the self, achieved through the rejection of inherited roles and the embrace of existential autonomy. By presenting a galaxy that has devolved into the debris of failed grand narratives, the film forces its protagonists to navigate a reality where the primary ethical challenge is not merely choosing between sides, but choosing to exist as an agent of change within a vacuum of authority. The moral calculus of the film is rooted in the transition from a state of institutional dogmatism to one of individual responsibility. The central ethical dilemma faced by Finn, Rey, and Kylo Ren, or Ben Solo, is the conflict between the roles assigned to them by systemic apparatuses and their innate capacity for moral divergence. Finn's desertion of the First Order represents the purest form of the absurd revolt. He confronts a universe defined by state-mandated cruelty and, through a singular, instinctual act of defiance, refuses to be a cog in the machine. His journey is an assertion that personhood is an inherent property of consciousness rather than a status granted by a state, a stance that demands the rejection of his entire social conditioning. While the First Order operates on a strictly utilitarian logic, prioritizing the greater good of absolute order through the erasure of dissent, Finn's transition to the Resistance marks a shift toward a deontological framework, where the preservation of individual life, specifically his own and that of his companion, Poe Dameron, becomes a fundamental moral imperative that overrides his programmatic conditioning. Rey's struggle, conversely, is characterized by the tension between the desire for external validation and the necessity of self-actualization. She begins the film anchored to the debris of a vanished history, tethered to the wreckage of past conflicts as if the past itself could provide a blueprint for her existence. Her arc is a process of stripping away the reliance on these historical ghosts. When she finally realizes that her truth is not contained within a lineage or a prophecy but within the agency of her own choices, she achieves a form of existential liberation. She constructs her own meaning by opting into a struggle that offers no guarantees, favoring the uncertainty of the present over the comfort of waiting for a narrative that was never meant for her. The antagonist, Kylo Ren, serves as the dark mirror to this search for autonomy. His internal conflict arises from a desperate, misplaced attempt to forge a radical identity by aligning himself with a perceived legacy of power. He views his violence as a necessary means to cleanse the disorder of the galaxy, trapped in the belief that he must perform his moral code to make it real. His failure to commit fully to this fabricated persona, punctuated by his agonizing internal struggle, reveals the fragility of his worldview. While the protagonists successfully navigate the transition from object to subject, Ren remains caught in a feedback loop, attempting to impose his will upon a reality that refuses to conform to his rigid ideology. Ultimately, The Force Awakens argues that the weight of the past is a psychological hurdle that must be overcome to achieve true ethical maturity. The film suggests that moral superiority is found in the willingness to suffer with the truth rather than retreating into the security of dogma. By the final act, the characters are no longer acting as subordinates to the grand narratives of the Jedi or the Sith, they are individuals defining themselves through direct, intimate contact with the force of their own resolve. The struggle for the galaxy is revealed to be a secondary concern to the primary, solitary task of defining the self. In this landscape, hope is not an abstract concept handed down by historical figures, but a tangible, daily creation of the individual, proving that the most significant act of rebellion in a decaying world is the simple, courageous decision to choose one's own path. Determinism, agency, and time. The Force Awakens functions as a profound meditation on the struggle between historical determinism and the terrifying, often paralyzing, nature of individual agency. The film establishes a universe where the past acts as a gravitational force, pulling every character toward the reenactment of previous trauma, grand narratives, and established power structures. This structural weight, visible in the rusted husks of Downstar destroyers on Jakku and the near-identical schematics of the Starkiller Base, creates a world where history feels like a closed loop. Characters operate under the shadow of preceding events, constantly measuring their present actions against the titans who shaped the galaxy decades prior. In this environment, the illusion of agency is the primary conflict. The protagonists are initially scavengers and defectors who believe they are merely surviving, yet they find themselves caught in a cycle that demands they inherit the roles of their predecessors. Rey and Finn embody the burden of choice within this deterministic framework. For Rey, existence on Jakku is defined by an obsessive, repetitive adherence to a promise of return, a narrative she constructs to justify her solitude. Her agency is functionally non-existent because she has deferred her identity to an external, vanished authority, her family. When she is thrust into the broader conflict, her journey is marked by an existential dread born of sudden, unearned freedom. The moment she is forced to make a decision that deviates from the survivalist path, she experiences the weight of responsibility. The film treats this burden as a crucible, suggesting that true agency is found only when a character consciously chooses to break from the orbit of their past and accept the uncertainty of an unwritten future. The antagonist, Kylo Ren, serves as the mirror for this deterministic struggle. His internal conflict is entirely rooted in a desperate desire to force himself into the predetermined shape of his lineage. Where others are paralyzed by the fear that their path is already carved, Ren actively seeks to accelerate his submission to that path. He views his agency not as a tool for self-determination, but as a mechanism to fulfill the requirements of a historical legacy. His violence is a logical, albeit distorted, attempt to solidify his identity against a reality that remains fluid. He represents the danger of surrendering to the pull of structuralism, illustrating that when an individual abdicates their autonomy to a system or a past narrative, they become a weapon of that history rather than an architect of the present. The Force, in this context, acts as the ultimate arbiter of the tension between fate and will. It is a field that binds all things and often seems to favor the restoration of balance through inevitable, rhythmic recurrence. However, the film asserts that this cosmic pressure does not absolve the individual of moral responsibility. The characters are constantly faced with the opportunity to succumb to the flow of history or to exert their will against it. When Finn chooses to abandon the Stormtrooper Corps, he commits an act of total rejection of the system that manufactured him. His decision is not a calculated maneuver but a raw exercise of choice that destabilizes the entire military apparatus. This singular pivot point proves that while the system is designed to replace every cog with a new one, the disruption caused by a conscious, rogue individual is sufficient to fracture the facade of inevitability. The final act of the film offers a synthesis that leans toward existential hope. The destruction of the Starkiller Base, a weapon designed to enforce order through total annihilation, is achieved not by the weight of a larger political machine, but by the focused, individual agency of those who have rejected their assigned roles. The film concludes with the image of Rey finding Luke Skywalker, a moment that suggests the cycle has not ended, but that the individuals involved have chosen to face the future without the comfort of a map. The struggle is shown to be the defining aspect of personhood. By the final frame, the narrative moves away from the nihilistic suggestion that all players are merely cogs in an infinite machine, instead validating the idea that the internal, agonizing process of choosing one's path is the only force capable of altering the trajectory of history. The characters are no longer defined by what they have lost or who they were born to be, but by the immediate, intentional acts of defiance they execute in the present. This shift confirms that while the past is an omnipresent influence, it possesses no mandate over the future. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The Force Awakens functions as a deliberate act of cinematic archaeology, utilizing a visual language that emphasizes the weight of history through the physical texture of its world. The film's cinematography establishes a hierarchy of power by grounding characters within environments that feel tactile and lived in, rejecting the sterile digital polish often associated with modern blockbusters. By prioritizing practical sets and tangible, weathered surfaces, the camera positions the protagonist, Rey, as a small, isolated figure navigating the remnants of an expansive, decaying mythos. Wide shots across the vast dunes of Jakku emphasize her insignificance against the scale of colossal, downed Imperial destroyers, transforming the landscape into a graveyard of ideologies where the environment itself dictates the terms of survival. Camera movement throughout the film serves as a witness to this history, fluctuating between the precise, controlled pans that mirror the cold, systemic precision of the First Order and a more kinetic, observational style that tracks the characters' emotional discoveries. During moments of intense conflict, the handheld, reactive camera work captures the visceral, unrefined nature of the characters' struggle, emphasizing that they are operating without the institutional support or rigid training of their predecessors. This movement reinforces the film's thesis: the Force is not merely a narrative device but a force of nature that erupts into these decaying, man-made spaces, forcing characters into moments of profound, unscripted change. The color palette architecture of the film serves as a narrative roadmap, contrasting the harsh, monochromatic stagnation of scavenged worlds with the vibrant, emotional spectrum of discovery. The desaturated, earthy tones of Jakku define a baseline of existential scarcity, where the characters exist in a perpetual state of transition. As the narrative progresses, the introduction of deep blues, fiery reds, and clean, icy whites in settings like Starkiller Base or the lush forests of Takodana marks a shift in the characters' internal mental states. The film uses these hues to externalize the conflict between inherited legacies and individual identity. The saturated red of Kylo Ren's unstable lightsaber, for instance, acts as a visual anchor, cutting through the shadows to highlight the violent, erratic nature of his internal struggle against his own lineage. The use of depth and negative space further isolates characters, physically manifesting their internal solitude. Characters are frequently framed against massive, hollowed-out hulls or within the vast, empty reaches of a starship, emphasizing their loneliness even when surrounded by the chaos of battle. This framing forces the audience to view the characters not as masters of their environment, but as entities caught in the slipstream of greater, unseen forces. When the camera focuses on Rey amidst the rusted metal of a Star Destroyer, the sheer depth of field renders her a singular point of focus against a horizon of past failure, highlighting the film's preoccupation with how individuals navigate the shadows cast by their ancestors. Light serves as the ultimate arbiter of truth and hidden intent, particularly in the film's reliance on dramatic chiaroscuro. The lighting design frequently obscures the faces of characters who are concealing their true motivations, casting figures like Kylo Ren in deep, fragmented shadow that physically fractures his persona. Conversely, light is used as a beacon of clarity during pivotal moments of realization, such as the illumination of the blue-hued glow of the Skywalker lightsaber. By manipulating light to reveal textures, the grit on a character's face, the rust on a machine, or the spark in a hopeful eye, the film grounds its philosophical inquiries in the physical world. The interplay of light and shadow reinforces that the characters are not merely fighting a political war, but are instead navigating a moral landscape where the difference between enlightenment and darkness is often found in the smallest, most granular details of the environment. The result is a work that succeeds by anchoring its sweeping, mythic narrative in a deeply realized physical reality, where every camera angle and shaft of light serves to bridge the gap between the monumental legacy of the past and the uncertain, searching nature of the present. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The visual identity of Star Wars, The Force Awakens functions as a deliberate exercise in physical grounding, prioritizing the tactile reality of its environments to anchor its digital interventions. By wedding high-fidelity CGI to an intensive commitment to practical set construction, the film achieves a seamless aesthetic integration where the synthetic becomes indistinguishable from the physical. The production design utilizes massive, built-from-scratch environments, such as the sprawling junkyard of Jakku, to provide a volumetric baseline for the digital additions. When CGI elements, such as the sweeping desert vistas or the internal mechanics of the Millennium Falcon, are introduced, they adhere strictly to the established lighting and color temperature of the location photography. The black levels and edge definition in the film's busiest sequences, particularly the chaotic aerial dogfights, maintain a consistent fidelity that prevents the floaty or detached quality often found in VFX-heavy blockbusters. The digital assets throughout the film strictly follow the physics of the practical world, ensuring that when objects collide or vehicles land, they carry a sense of mass and inertia. The weight of the ships is felt in their movement and their interaction with the terrain, whether a TIE fighter skids across the sand or the Falcon exerts pressure on the ground during a rough landing. The digital physics mirror the inertia of physical models. This weightiness is bolstered by the film's invisible VFX, which extend far beyond the obvious creatures or space battles. Extensive sky replacements and subtle set extensions are woven into the periphery of frames, functioning as environmental texture rather than mere spectacle. By populating the frame with digital elements that operate within the logic of practical cinematography, using lens flares, heat haze, and motion blur consistent with the cameras, the film removes the sharp, sterile clarity that usually exposes digital artifice. The film successfully navigates the uncanny valley by grounding its alien inhabitants and digital performances in tangible, physical detail. The creature design, which heavily favors animatronics and practical prosthetics, forces the digital-to-physical handoff to occur in areas of high sensory density, such as the subtle movement of skin or the wet sheen of an eye. In moments where digital characters interact with human actors, the lighting engine of the CGI mirrors the diffuse or high-contrast light sources present on the set, ensuring that no character feels pasted onto the background. The result is an economic aesthetic that feels expensive not because of the sheer quantity of digital pixels, but because of the intentional, microscopic attention paid to how light behaves on varying surfaces. Ultimately, this technical approach serves the film's narrative commitment to a lived-in, decaying galaxy. The choice to prioritize grain, halation, and organic light decay over digital perfection reflects a world where history is physically inscribed upon its environments. The VFX work acts as an extension of this philosophy. The technology is never used to create a frictionless, idealized space, but rather to expand the depth and scope of a world already heavy with the wear of past conflicts. By ensuring the synthetic blends into the practical, the film creates a consistent, cohesive reality that demands the audience's belief, proving that the highest achievement of VFX is the creation of a seamless world where the illusion is so robust that the technology itself disappears. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. Star Wars: The Force Awakens operates as a sensory restoration project, utilizing audio, rhythmic pacing, and tactical silences to re-establish the tactile, lived-in texture of a galaxy that had become increasingly digitized and frictionless in preceding cinematic iterations. The sound design serves as the primary bridge between the audience and the narrative, grounding the fantastical elements of the Force and starship combat in a grounded, industrial reality. By prioritizing the heavy, mechanical percussion of the world, the grinding of gears on Jakku, the deep thrum of the Millennium Falcon's engines, and the sharp, snapping crackle of the unstable crossguard lightsaber, the film anchors its high-concept mythology in tangible physics. The sonic environment is intentionally dense and cluttered, mirroring the scavenged, patchwork state of the post-Empire galaxy. On Jakku, the mix is defined by the abrasive, coarse sounds of wind and rusted metal, which serve as a persistent reminder of the protagonist's scarcity and isolation. This cacophony functions as a psychological externalization of Rey's environment. She is a character defined by the noise of her labor, perpetually caught in the mechanical rhythms of a graveyard of machines. When the film transitions to the pristine, sterile environments of the First Order, the audio shift is immediate and jarring. The silence of the Starkiller Base command deck or the hum of a TIE fighter becomes unnervingly clinical. This contrast demonstrates how the film uses the auditory landscape to delineate ideological boundaries. The Republic and the Resistance are defined by warm, organic, and chaotic textures, while the First Order is defined by cold, synthesized precision and the crushing weight of synchronized silence. The editing rhythm follows the trajectory of a kinetic, propulsive adventure, yet it deliberately fractures during moments of profound character interiority. During the sequences involving Kylo Ren, the editing tempo slows, favoring long, steady takes that emphasize the character's internal volatility. The sound mix during these moments often pulls back from the environmental noise, focusing instead on the heavy, rhythmic breathing associated with his mask. This audio perspective places the viewer directly inside the suffocating, claustrophobic ego of the antagonist, turning his own armor into a sonic prison. Similarly, when Rey experiences the Force vision, the film blurs the line between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. The score bleeds into the environment, and historical echoes of previous galactic events are layered over the immediate sounds of her surroundings, suggesting that the Force is not merely a power, but a living, auditory record of the past that collapses the distance between the character and the weight of history. The film employs silence as a strategic weapon, most notably during the climactic confrontation on Starkiller Base. By stripping away the score and minimizing environmental ambience during pivotal moments of character recognition, such as the final interaction between Han Solo and Kylo Ren, the film demands a heightened level of emotional proximity from the viewer. These silences act as a vacuum, pulling focus toward the vulnerability of the characters. In the absence of an orchestral swell to guide the audience's emotional response, the raw, visceral sound of a lightsaber igniting or a voice cracking becomes the focal point of the scene. This choice strips away the spectacle to expose the underlying tragedy of the characters, forcing a direct encounter with their trauma. Furthermore, the rhythm of the film is carefully calibrated to sustain a sense of technological momentum. The cuts during combat sequences are dictated by the physical trajectory of the vessels, maintaining a spatial coherence that reinforces the danger of the environment. The sound of the starships, no longer the slick, aerodynamic hum of a high-tech era, but the sputter, groan, and roar of aging, high-performance machinery, establishes a sense of historical continuity. The auditory experience of the ship interiors, characterized by hydraulic hisses and the rattling of hull plates, insists that the characters are inhabiting a precarious, decaying reality. By prioritizing these mechanical sounds, the film succeeds in creating an illusion of weight and urgency. The technical craft of the sound design and editing works in service of a philosophy that equates survival with the ability to maintain one's own machinery in a world that is fundamentally broken. The ultimate achievement of this sensory manipulation is that it makes the vastness of the galaxy feel immediate, physical, and profoundly fragile, grounding the grand narrative of the Force in the heartbeat of its characters. Synthesis of craft. The technical architecture of The Force Awakens serves as a deliberate material reclamation, grounding the digital advancements of the 21st century in the tactile, imperfect physical legacy of the original trilogy. By prioritizing practical sets and tangible puppetry, the production creates a visual hierarchy that validates the reality of the characters within the frame. The decision to shoot on 35mm film, rather than high-definition digital, provides a necessary textural density that makes the expansive desert of Jakku or the cold, metallic corridors of the Starkiller Base feel like lived-in, aged environments. This aesthetic choice functions as a narrative anchor, suggesting that the galaxy is a place of history and consequence rather than a frictionless, procedural simulation. The cinematography utilizes an aggressive interplay of focal length to establish the psychological geography of the protagonists. Wide-angle lenses are frequently deployed to immerse the viewer in the claustrophobic clutter of scavenger outposts, emphasizing the overwhelming scale of the machinery that dwarfs the individual. Conversely, the film employs longer, telephoto lenses during moments of interpersonal conflict, compressing the background to isolate characters within their own internal crises. This spatial manipulation isolates Rey and Kylo Ren, forcing the viewer to confront the isolation inherent in their respective quests for identity. The camera behaves as an inquisitive, handheld witness during action sequences, lending an erratic, visceral energy to the combat that contrasts sharply with the calculated, godlike stillness of shots focused on the vastness of the galaxy. Lighting throughout the film utilizes chiaroscuro to exteriorize the internal state of the characters, particularly concerning the encroaching darkness of the First Order. In the presence of Kylo Ren, lighting is intentionally reductive, often leaving large swaths of the frame in deep, abyssal shadow. This visual motif serves as a literal manifestation of the Jungian shadow, representing the repressed traits and violent impulses that the antagonist seeks to integrate into his own fractured ego. The contrast is never merely stylistic, it is a fundamental tool for defining moral stakes, where the encroaching shadows act as an active participant in the corruption of the light. The integration of digital effects within this physical framework is defined by a commitment to weight and physics. When CGI is utilized, most notably in the complex integration of the Millennium Falcon, the effects artists adhere to the Newtonian constraints of the practical set pieces. There is a palpable heaviness to the digital assets, they occupy space, cast shadows, and interact with the environment in ways that respect the established lighting cues of the location. This technical discipline prevents the uncanny valley from disrupting the viewer's immersion, ensuring that the digital artifice remains subservient to the narrative momentum. Even the invisible effects, the digital extensions of the sprawling debris fields on Jakku, are textured with a grime and layering that mirror the real-world detritus on the forest floor, creating a seamless continuity between the physical and the virtual. The choreography of the frame frequently relies on long, fluid takes that favor movement over rapid-fire editing. By allowing the camera to follow characters through the intricate, rusted-out ruins of history, the film creates a sense of spatial permanence. This reliance on uninterrupted motion suggests that the characters are physically bound to their environment, trapped within the corridors and landscapes of a past they cannot escape. It transforms the act of navigation into a form of character development, showing how Rey or Finn physically react to the obstructions of their world, whether it be the shifting sands of a dune or the labyrinthine geometry of a bunker. Ultimately, the film reaches its peak of technical and philosophical synthesis in the final encounter on the snow-covered base. The stark, high-contrast environment reduces the visual palette to white, red, and shadow, stripping away the narrative noise to focus entirely on the emotional collision between the two leads. The camera work here is precise and unrelenting, eschewing broad spectacles to focus on the intimate terror of the confrontation. The technical mastery, the use of light to define the divide between the combatants and the lens choices that pull the viewer into their immediate distress, functions as a mirror to the film's core argument, that the future of this galaxy is not a grand, automated sweep of destiny, but the hard, physical consequence of individual choice. Through its rigorous application of craft, the film solidifies the idea that the soul of the work lies in the tension between the worn-out reality we inherit and the fragile, human agency we exercise to reshape it. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Star Wars, Episode 7, The Force Awakens functions as a sophisticated interrogation of how generational trauma and historical memory manifest within a cyclical political framework. Rather than a mere continuation of a previous cinematic saga, the film acts as an exploration of the burden of legacy, where the central conflict arises from the necessity of individual agency navigating a landscape saturated with the debris of past ideologies. The film posits that the primary struggle of its characters is not the destruction of a regime, but the existential task of defining one's identity within a reality defined by the echoing, often crushing, weight of predecessors. The world building establishes a reality defined by scarcity and the reclamation of wreckage. On the desert planet of Jakku, the economy is entirely predicated on the scavenged remains of a fallen empire. This visual geography creates a society where the present is quite literally built upon the rusted, discarded skeletons of history. The architecture of the First Order and the Resistance reflects this tension between a desperate desire for order and the inevitable decay of grand narratives. By positioning the characters in a physical environment that mirrors their internal displacement, the film demonstrates how the individual is forced to synthesize meaning from the fragments of prior belief systems. This economic reliance on the artifacts of the past serves as a potent metaphor for the protagonist's psychological state. They are inhabitants of an afterworld, tasked with reclaiming their autonomy in a space where every horizon is cluttered with the wreckage of yesterday's battles. At the core of this experience is the epistemic fracture felt by its lead characters. Rey's journey is defined by a deep-seated denial, a fabricated ego constructed around the hope of a return that is fundamentally disconnected from the harsh reality of her isolation. Her trauma is somatic, manifested in the solitary, repetitive labor of a scavenger who defines her worth through survival. Kylo Ren represents the inverse psychological trauma. He is consumed by the performance of legacy, burdened by a meta-narrative of greatness that he feels compelled to violently manifest. Their dynamic is parasitic, as Kylo Ren attempts to drain the emotional capital of the past to legitimize his current power, while Rey must transcend her need for a historical identity to find a coherent sense of self. The film excels in portraying this internal struggle through its visual language. The vast, isolating landscapes of its set pieces consistently render the individual as a small, flickering presence against the cold, imposing silhouettes of technological ruins. Philosophically, the film delves into the struggle between deterministic history and the existential assertion of the will. The characters are trapped in a feedback loop where their attempts to define the future are conditioned by their interpretation of the past. The Force acts as the ultimate epistemic authority, shifting from a mystical tradition to an undeniable, albeit often misunderstood, physical truth. By placing characters in positions where they must choose between adherence to the established dogma of their respective factions and the messy, authentic impulses of their own morality, the film rejects the comfort of systemic solutions. It presents the quest for meaning as an inherently absurd task, suggesting that while the structures of the world, the First Order, the Resistance, the Jedi, may fail or stagnate, the individual's capacity to choose remains the only true source of moral weight. Technically, the film achieves its vision through a deliberate blend of practical weight and digital scale. The decision to prioritize tangible textures and physical sets reinforces the film's thesis regarding the importance of history. The cinematography utilizes wide, sweeping shots to establish the scale of the system, yet it consistently pulls back into the intimate, claustrophobic framing of character-focus moments, effectively trapping the viewer in the character's internal dissonance. The sound design acts as a primary emotional trigger, utilizing the iconic motifs of the past to create a sense of déjà vu, which the film then disrupts with the discordant, harsher sounds of a new, more uncertain conflict. This technical execution grounds the philosophical arguments, making the struggle for agency feel tangible and immediate. The final legacy of The Force Awakens resides in its refusal to offer a clean resolution. The closing image of Rey extending the lightsaber to Luke Skywalker is not a conclusion but an invitation to confront the truth of the past without being subsumed by it. The film leaves the viewer in a state of suspended potential, suggesting that the cycle of history only maintains its hold if the individual refuses to define their own path. It is a work that acknowledges the inevitability of the past while asserting the necessity of the present. By grounding its narrative in the grit of scavenged ruins and the raw, unrefined trauma of its leads, the film serves as a testament to the idea that identity is not inherited, but forged through the active, often painful, rejection of historical inevitability. It demands that the protagonist, and by extension the viewer, move beyond the role of a scavenger of history and into the role of an architect of their own future.